Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you again this morning. It was the summer of 1995. I was headed into my senior year in high school and was spending the summer working in Grand Rapids, Michigan at a church through a program known then as SWIM, Summer Workshop in Ministry. I was supposed to be there for 4 weeks working with a team of 3 other students. The plan was for someone else to come and take my place after my 4 weeks were finished and to finish up the summer with the team while I went back home. For some reason, my replacement couldn't come, and so I was asked to stay an additional 3 weeks. This was a great opportunity for me. I loved what I was doing that summer. I loved the people that I was working with. I loved the things that I was learning. I loved the mentors that I was meeting and learning from. But I missed being home as well. I missed my family. I missed my friends. I missed making money at my job. And so I had a decision to make. I found myself sitting with my host family one night trying to decide what to do. We were watching a baseball game. It was a Cubs game, I remember. And as I watched and tried to figure out what I should do for the next few weeks, I came up with a spontaneous plan. See, Sammy Sosa was up to bat. Sammy Sosa was an outfielder for the Chicago Cubs, and Sammy Sosa liked to hit home runs. So I decided that if Sammy hit a home run, that at bat, I would stay. If not, I would go back home. It was genius, I thought. Sammy Sosa hit home runs. And so the chances of him hitting one was better than any other Cub, a player at the moment. But he didn't hit him every at bat. And so if he did hit one, I would know for sure that I was supposed to stay. Now, there are a lot of issues with my plan. But at its essence, what I really wanted to know, what I was really asking was, God, what's your plan for me? God, what's your will for my life? God, what would you have me do? It wasn't the first time or the last time that I asked those questions in my life, and I'm guessing I'm not the only one who's asked those questions either. Knowing God's will seems to be difficult most of the time. In the best of times, we have questions about our future, or why certain things happen, or about whether we should do this or do that. Should I go to Calvin University or Denver University? Should I take a job in Los Angeles or in New York? Should I go on vacation this summer to the East Coast or to the West Coast? Should I go on a date with John or with Steve? Should I major in engineering or in English? Should I buy a Subaru or a Ford? Should I give money to that person on the side of the street or not? Let's be honest, for most of us, the last 3 or 4 months haven't been the best of times for various reasons. Do we go on vacation at all this summer or not? Do I lay off workers, or do I keep paying them, even though there isn't any work to be done? What do I do if I get laid off? Do we worship together, or do we physically distance ourselves from each other? Do I wear a mask or not? Do we vote for Trump or for Biden? Do we send our kids to school to physically actually send them to school, or do we keep them home? Do I support Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter or All Lives Matter or what? Do I talk to my kids and my family and my neighbors and my friends about the social unrest and injustices in our country, or do I just ignore it? Knowing what God wants us to do might seem like a fairy tale, or a birthday wish, or a shot in the dark at best. Abraham's servant must have had some similar thoughts as he left his master's side and headed off to an unknown place in the story that we read today from Genesis 24. And as his servant headed off, he headed off to try to find a woman to marry Abraham's son Isaac, and a woman who would return with him to a foreign land, to an unknown land, to marry someone she hadn't met. He needed to know exactly who the right woman was. He needed God's guidance, and he needed to know God's will. Let's take a look at this story from Genesis 27 this morning, and then in this context, in the context of knowing God's will for us, and in the context of looking for God to show up. Isaac needed a wife. Abraham had lived a long life, and it had been many years since he had been called by God to go to a land that he didn't know. Since God had promised to make him into a great and chosen nation, to give him land and descendants and possessions. And God had blessed Abraham during these years. He'd given him land and possessions. He'd given him even a son in his old age. And Abraham was now nearing the end of his life. And he didn't want everything that had happened, all that God had done for him and done through him, to be wasted. His son, Isaac, needed a wife, someone to carry on the family line, someone to carry on the blessings that God had brought to Abraham and his family. Someone who wouldn't just tie Isaac and Abraham's descendants to a local family or tribe. You see, if Isaac married a local woman, the risk of his land and his possessions and all that God had done for Abraham and his family, and Isaac now being absorbed by this local family or group or nation, was very real. Abraham's line needed to stay distinct and separate. And so Abraham sent his servant back to his homeland, to his own descendants, to find a wife for Isaac. Someone who would be as distinct and as foreign as Abraham was. The servant knew that this was a tall order. Travel to a far-off land, find exactly the right woman who would marry Isaac sight unseen, and who would leave her family, or whose family would allow her to leave, to go back with the servant to marry Isaac. But he did as his master wanted, and he left on his journey. The servant must have been thinking the whole time that he traveled, how am I going to make this happen? And so he came up with a plan. He would sit by a well once he reached his destination, and he would ask for a drink. And if the woman who responded not only gave him a drink, but also offered to water his camels until they had their fill, she would be the one. Now, I'm not sure how many of us have experienced watering camels, but drawing water for a lone traveler wasn't much to ask. Drawing water for 10 travel-weary camels was quite something. A camel that's traveled a few days through the desert without drinking can drink up to 25 gallons of water at one time. And the servant had 10 camels. A typical watering jar from this time would have held about 3 gallons, we know from history and from geography, or geology. But quick math has led me this week to the fact that this would have meant 8 or 9 jars per camel. 80 or 90 jars of water had to be drawn to water these camels. This was no small ask and no small task. But that was the answer that the servant came up with for the question and for the problem that he laid before God in order to understand God's will. We've seen this sort of thing happen a few other places in the Bible as well. This is known as an oracle, a yes or no question posed to a deity with some outlandish outcome to a normal situation being the way that the deity would communicate the answer. It couldn't be a simple yes or no thing. It couldn't be simply as if someone comes to the well, the first person there is the winner. My solution about Sammy Sosa hitting a home run during a certain at-bat was a little bit more outlandish, but it still probably didn't fit the bill of the oracle. We see this a few other places in the Bible as well. Gideon does something similar in Judges chapter 6. He put a fleece out on the ground, and he said to God that if the fleece was wet the next morning by the morning dew, but the ground around it was dry, then he would know God's will and he would know God's answer. Gideon wasn't quite as convinced. He wasn't quite sure that this once strange occurrence was God's answer, and so he did it again the next night. He put it out and he said, but the other way around this time, if the ground is wet but the fleece is dry, then he would know God's will. There are a slim few other examples of this type of thing in the Bible as well, but while we see these elsewhere in Scripture a few times, it's important for us to know that this really isn't the norm. This isn't normally how God guides his people and shares his will. But this is how the servant posed a question to God. And it's important to note that even if this may not be how normally God chooses to show his will, God does guide his people. In this instance with the servant and in other instances as well, God shows up. See, the servant sits by the well and he asks Rebekah for some water. She draws it for him and she waters his camel as well. And as the servant watches, the servant sees this whole thing unfolds, and the servant knows that this is the woman that God had picked. She fulfilled the oracle that he had presented to God. She was the one that he had been looking for. She would be the perfect wife for Isaac for all the reasons that we talked about earlier. Well, gifts were exchanged, the family agreed to the marriage, and the servant asked to be able to depart immediately, and Rebekah agreed. She would be a covenant partner for Isaac that God had chosen. As Rebekah's family sent her away with the servant, they blessed her. They said, "May you increase to thousands and thousands, and may your offspring possess the cities of their enemies." These are important blessings. These are blessings that echo the covenant blessings and promises that God had made with Abraham years ago and all throughout Abraham's life. There can't be any doubt that God was in control of all of this, that this was his will. So what's our takeaway today? Well, maybe we should go back to the question that we began with this morning, the question that I was really asking God during a Cubs game during the summer of 1995. How often would we like to know the will of God for our lives? I think the answer is all the time. We'd like to have a direct line to God, a big red cell phone perhaps that connects us directly to the throne room of heaven, where we can ask any question that we might have about decisions and dilemmas and problems. And while we certainly can ask God any question that we have, and we are encouraged to ask those things even, we may not always get the clear answers that we often think we should get or that we sometimes look for. It might be tempting for us to read a story like we read from Genesis 24 this morning and to say, that's how we should learn God's will. By putting God to some outlandish test where we want to know something, where he has to do something exactly how we say. Do we test God with oracles like the servant did today? I think the answer is no. Jesus says when he's tempted in the desert by the devil with a very similar situation, with a temptation to put an oracle before God to get an answer, Jesus says, don't put God to the test. And we shouldn't either. My 1995 Sammy Sosa home run answer wasn't really the right way to go. Maybe let's talk about another solution this morning. A solution that really, in spite of the oracle, Abraham's servant discovered. Now, as a side note, maybe inherent in this solution is something important that I think we have to understand about God's will. Well, at times it might be very narrow, like maybe it was for the servant and for Isaac and for Abraham and for Rebekah. Most of the time, it's more broad. Instead of thinking about it as the center of a dartboard, maybe the answer is the whole dartboard itself. Instead of thinking about God's will as the swings in a playground to play on, maybe it's better to think about it as the whole playground to play in. Maybe, how about instead of testing God with some specific certain thing, we simply decide to pay attention to God? That might be one of the hardest things for us to do, honestly. Life is busy. We get distracted. We think things should be one way and not another. There's a fictional story that's told about a man who had been forced onto his roof due to the rising floodwaters around him. As he watched the waters rise all around him and he stood on his roof, he prayed to God to deliver him. And he had a strong faith, a belief that God would do just that God would answer his question. Soon enough, a neighbor came by in a boat and invited the man in. But the man on the roof refused because he had faith that God would deliver him. As the waters continued to rise and the man was forced up to the very peak of his roof, a National Guard rescue boat came by and once again invited the man in. But the man on the roof again refused because he believed that God would rescue him. As the sun set and the waters continued to rise, the man climbed up onto the very top of his chimney to escape the floodwaters. And in the middle of the night, a helicopter hovered over the chimney and shined a spotlight on the man and dropped a ladder down to him. But he again refused, knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that God would rescue him. Before dawn, the man was overcome by the floodwaters and swept away and died. And as he stood before God, he lamented that despite his strong faith, God did not deliver him, and he was sad. And God simply replied, "I sent 2 boats and a helicopter. What else did you want?" And while this story is told with a little bit of humor, there's truth to it as well. See, often we miss what God is saying to us because we're looking for him to fulfill the oracles that we lay out in a certain way, or the playbooks that we make up in a certain situation, or the answer doesn't come in the form that we're looking for. See, we look for the answers that we want, not necessarily the answers that God provides. And so, friends, this morning, I want to encourage you to pay attention. Pay attention to the lessons of Scripture, God's way of revealing himself to us through stories and teachings, and above all, the example and sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Pay attention to prayer, and as you pray, it's our way of communicating to God, where we can ask him anything and take our praises and our requests, our laments, our longings, and our thanksgivings to him, and where he answers us. Pay attention to those closest to you, to those who love you and who know you the most, who have your best interests in mind, the community that you're a part of that God has placed you in. Pay attention to the world around you, where God is active and working every day through his Spirit. Pay attention every day to big moments and to small moments, to monumental and to the minute, to the screams and the whispers. They are there every day. Pay attention every day, because sometimes we simply aren't paying attention. Or we're looking for one thing and we miss another thing because we have blinders on. I think this has been really clear to us, this idea of paying attention over the last 4 months or so, both individually and as a church, as we've been separate, as things have been different, as we've been trying to figure out what's going on in our world. We've been called to pay attention to God's guiding. I was listening to an online webinar pretty early on during our lockdown where some well-known church leaders were talking about leadership during this time. They admitted quite readily that no one really knew how to lead during these times. The situation was different than anything any of us had ever gone through. But then they said something that I think has guided both our church and me personally, really, over the last few months. And I think it speaks to searching for and to understanding God's will. They said, remember who God is, and remember who you are. Remember what you're here for. Remember your church's vision and mission and purpose and ministries prior to COVID-19 and the shutdowns and lockdowns. Those things that we thought out and that we worked over and that we prayed over for years prior. They said those things haven't changed as guidance, as vision, as mission, as purpose. We're still who we are, and we're still called to do what we've always done. And yes, it was going to look different, but the core of God's will for our church, for our ministries, for me personally, and for my life, for my family, for my community, they weren't really any different. God's will for our church was to continue to be a family of God, living our faith and growing by joyfully surrendering to Jesus, freely sharing our lives, and humbly embracing the hurting. Knowing that God is so much, knowing that made it's so much easier to see where God was calling us and what he might be calling us to do, even in confusing and strange times. So friends, again, I invite and encourage you this morning, today, whenever you're listening to this or whenever you think through this, to pay attention. Look for God's fingerprints to show up in big and small ways through every aspect of life. Don't get lost looking for God to show up in circumstances that we dictate, or to show up how we think he should, and to miss how he actually does show up to us every day. Don't get lost looking for specifics when maybe the broad thing is what God is asking us to do. Instead, prayerfully and carefully observe the circumstances that God is laying out for you and go where God is sending you. It may look specific. It may look like it did for Abraham's servant. He paid attention to what God showed him, and it led him directly to Rebekah, the perfect covenant partner for Isaac. And it may look more general, not a specific answer, like take this job or go to this college or talk to this person, but maybe general guidance and direction nonetheless. Serve God wherever we are. Use the gifts that he's given us, whatever we do. Stay faithful to his commands, to love him, to love God, and to love others with everything that we have, wherever we find ourselves, as we've been called to do. So friends, today I ask you to pay attention. This week, I ask you to pay attention to what God is saying to you, to what God is doing in the world around you, and to what God is asking you to do. And may God bless you all, bless us all this week as we seek to serve him where he's placed us and to love others as he's asked us to love.